Churches, places of worship, peace, and salvation. But what if I told you that not all holy grounds are safe? That some churches hold dark secrets, ghostly apparitions, and unexplainable horrors. From a mysterious entity in an abandoned cathedral to eerie whispers during midnight prayers, these real-life church horror stories will leave you questioning what truly lingers in the house of God. Story 1, The Haunted Borley Rectory. The year was 1862 when Borley Rectory, an imposing Gothic mansion, was built on the isolated outskirts of Borley Village in Essex, England. The rectory was constructed to serve as the home for the rector of Borley Church, along with his family. The building, with its tall, pointed spires and intricate stonework, seemed like something out of a dark fairy tale. The church was nestled on the edge of the property, and the rectory itself sat surrounded by an overgrown, untended garden, hidden away from the prying eyes of the outside world. Its desolation created an atmosphere that invited whispers of fear. It was a place that appeared to be frozen in time, its eerie beauty intensified by the damp mist that often hung in the air. A place that people would describe as alive, not with the joy of family and community, but with something far darker. Borley Rectory stood as a symbol of the past, and soon it would become a symbol of something far more sinister. Those who ventured to the rectory often returned with unsettling stories, and for the locals, the first signs of something unnatural began not long after the rectory was finished. The hauntings started with small, almost imperceptible events. Objects moved when no one was near, doors that creaked open by themselves, whispers in the halls when there was no one present. But it wasn't long before these strange occurrences escalated. The Borley Rectory wasn't just any house. It was cursed, and it seemed to grow darker with every passing year. A deep sense of dread soaked into the air itself, and the once beautiful gardens withered under the weight of the terror that began to emanate from the building. Soon, the stories became so widespread that people started calling it the most haunted house in England. As the years passed, the strange occurrences grew more frequent and violent. The new rector and his family, who moved into the rectory in 1927, were the first to experience its full horrors. The family was initially excited to take up residence in the beautiful home, but they soon realized that Borley Rectory was far from welcoming. It was not long before the unexplained began to shake their faith in the house. The first incident occurred on a stormy night. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the halls, a sound that reverberated across the wooden floors. The rector, a devout man, rushed from room to room, searching for the source of the noise, but found nothing. No one. The sounds continued to echo through the house, reverberating in places where no one was walking. As if answering the question of who or what was causing the noises, a figure appeared, a ghostly nun, her face obscured by the darkness, was seen in the garden, standing near the edge of the property, gazing toward the church. The sighting of the nun became a frequent occurrence. Local legend had it that she was the spirit of a nun who had been buried on the grounds after being murdered many years earlier. Her ghostly figure was seen wandering the halls at night, always silent and always vanishing before anyone could approach her. The rectory's residents were plagued by disembodied voices, the faint ringing of bells, and the eerie sensation of being watched. The events began to intensify, reaching a fever pitch when the sound of a bell, as if from the nearby church tower, rang throughout the house in the dead of night. But there was no one in the tower, and the church bell had not been rung in years. One night, a strange, inexplicable event took place. A set of objects, including chairs and books, moved on their own in front of witnesses. There was no logical explanation. The rector, a man deeply steeped in faith, began to question everything he believed in. Was this a divine test, a warning, or something far worse? By this time, the terrifying events surrounding Borley Rectory had attracted the attention of paranormal researcher Harry Price, an expert in the study of hauntings. Price had heard rumors of the strange happenings at Borley and was determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. He arrived in 1929, ready to investigate. Price immediately began setting up seances, hoping to make contact with the spirits. One night, during a particularly harrowing seance, something chilling happened. The spirits communicated a prophecy, one that would change the fate of the rectory forever. The message, relayed through a trembling medium, was clear. The rectory will burn down, revealing a secret that has long been buried. The room fell silent, and a cold wind swept through the chamber. The medium collapsed, drained, as though the very essence of life had been pulled from her. It was as though the building itself had spoken, its fate sealed in the flames that would one day consume it. The prophecy, which had been dismissed by some as a mere trick, would prove to be all too true. In 1939, the Borley Rectory, this towering, cursed monument to the past, caught fire just as the spirits had foretold. It was a fire that spread quickly and uncontrollably, consuming everything in its path. By the time firefighters arrived, the rectory was little more than a smoldering ruin. The cause of the fire was never determined, and despite several investigations, there were no signs of foul play. It seemed as though the fire had been predestined, as if something within the rectory had been waiting for the moment to strike. As the smoke cleared and the charred remains of the rectory smoldered, workers began to sift through the wreckage. What they found sent a chill down the spine of everyone who heard about it. Skeletal remains buried beneath the rubble. The remains, believed to belong to a woman, were hidden deep in the earth, as if someone had tried to bury the truth. Local rumors quickly spread, and it was speculated that the remains were those of the long-dead nun, the woman who had been murdered so many years before, and whose restless spirit had tormented the rectory ever since. A local priest held a funeral for the remains, hoping that the act of giving the woman a proper burial would end the torment that had plagued the area for so long. But despite the priest's efforts, the haunting did not stop. The spirits of Borley Rectory lingered. In the wake of the fire, Borley Rectory was never rebuilt. The land, now cursed by the spirits that haunted it, was left abandoned. However, its notoriety only grew. The place became a magnet for ghost hunters, paranormal researchers, and thrill seekers, all eager to experience the terror that had been so carefully documented. Though the rectory no longer stood, the spirit of the place remained. Visitors to the site still report strange sensations, a feeling of being watched, a sudden drop in temperature, and sightings of shadowy figures that vanish when approached. Some claim to hear the sound of footsteps that follow them, echoing through the overgrown ruins. The ghostly nun, once seen walking the grounds, is still rumored to make appearances. The sound of an unearthly bell tolling in the dead of night, too, continues to be heard by some brave enough to venture near. The legend of Borley Rectory lives on as one of the most chilling hauntings in church history, a reminder that some places, no matter how beautiful or serene they may appear, are tainted by darkness. Borley Rectory stands as an ominous reminder of the buried secrets of the past, waiting for someone to uncover them. But perhaps some secrets are better left untouched. Even now, the site is a grim pilgrimage for those who seek the unknown, and the legend of Borley Rectory continues to haunt the imaginations of those who dare to remember it. Story 2: The Exorcism of Anneliese Michel. In the early 1970s, in the quiet rural town of Klingenberg, Germany, a young Catholic woman named Anneliese Michel began to exhibit strange behaviors that would soon become the subject of chilling horror and controversy. Born into a devout Catholic family in 1952, Anneliese was raised with deep religious convictions. She was known to be a quiet, pious young woman, but in 1975, when Anneliese was 23, something inexplicable began to happen to her. At first, her behavior was not alarming. She started having mild episodes of depression and confusion, and she would occasionally act out of character. But what started as simple mood swings soon escalated into something far more terrifying. Anneliese began to hear strange sounds, whispers, voices, and growls that no one else could hear. At first, she thought it was the product of stress or a mental breakdown. However, her condition worsened rapidly, and what followed sent her family into a state of panic. She began to experience violent physical symptoms. Her body convulsed, her limbs jerked uncontrollably, and her eyes rolled back in her head. Her face twisted in unnatural ways, and she began to speak in guttural, unrecognizable tones. It seemed as if something had taken control of her. At night, her mother would hear her daughter thrashing in her bed, screaming in agony, begging for help, though no one could discern exactly what she was saying. Doctors were consulted, but the medical treatments failed to make any significant difference. Anneliese was diagnosed with several psychological disorders, including depression and possibly schizophrenia. Yet none of these diagnoses explained the increasingly horrific symptoms she displayed. She began to exhibit bizarre behavior. She would growl at people, bark like an animal, and frequently cower in the corner of her room, as if hiding from an unseen presence. Her family began to fear that something darker, something more sinister, was at work. Anneliese herself began to believe that she was possessed. She had always been a devout Catholic, and she believed that the demon tormenting her was using her body as a vessel for some malevolent purpose. But it wasn't just Anneliese who believed this. Her family, particularly her mother, was convinced that the girl had fallen under the influence of dark forces. They turned to the church for help, seeking an exorcism in an attempt to rid her of whatever had taken hold of her. Their prayers were desperate and their faith unwavering, but the church's response was slow and cautious. Anneliese's condition deteriorated dramatically, and her behavior became increasingly alarming. She began speaking in unfamiliar languages she had never studied or heard before. These were not just mere words or gibberish. They were coherent, structured sentences spoken in an ancient dialect that no one in the family could understand. It was as though Anneliese was speaking through the voice of something otherworldly, something far beyond her comprehension. Her reaction to religious symbols was even more disturbing. Whenever she was near a crucifix or a Bible, she would recoil violently, as though the very presence of the holy symbols repulsed her. At times, she would hiss like a snake when a priest or family member tried to offer her the sacraments, her eyes filled with a burning hatred for everything sacred. She refused to enter the church, calling it the house of the devil. Her mother, deeply religious and in denial of the possibility of a psychological illness, saw these reactions as signs that Anneliese was no longer in control of her own body and soul. As the months wore on, Anneliese began to self-harm in increasingly disturbing ways. She would scratch at her own skin until it bled, bite herself, and tear at her hair in fits of rage. She would constantly pull at her clothes, trying to tear them off as though something inside her was urging her to do so. She claimed that she was being tormented by demonic voices, voices that whispered vile things to her, urging her to give in to their power. The voices mocked her, told her she was worthless, and threatened her with eternal damnation. Her family, now terrified and at their wits' end, turned to the church once more, desperate for any intervention. After many long, agonizing weeks, their prayers were answered when they were granted permission to proceed with an exorcism. The church, which had long been skeptical about such matters, finally authorized two priests, Father Arnold Renz and Father Ernst Alt, to perform the ritual of exorcism on Anneliese. It was a decision that would come to haunt them all. The exorcisms began in 1975, and the terror only escalated. The priests were not prepared for the horrors they would face. Over the next 10 months, a total of 67 exorcisms were performed on Anneliese, each more harrowing and exhausting than the last. Some of the sessions were recorded, capturing chilling voices that no human could ever make, voices that sounded as if they were coming from the very bowels of hell. Anneliese's physical and mental state continued to deteriorate. Her body was frail from extreme fasting, which she had insisted upon in an effort to rid herself of the demonic influence. Her once healthy frame had become skeletal, her eyes sunken deep into her skull. Yet through it all, the demons inside her persisted. The priest could hear the sounds of her voice shifting from her own to something altogether darker. Demonic voices, each speaking in a different tone, as if possessed by multiple entities. In one of the most terrifying moments, Anneliese spoke in several voices at once. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin as she muttered the names of figures from history. Lucifer, Nero, Cain, and others. She claimed to be the embodiment of these historical figures, speaking in their voices, using their knowledge and memories. It was as though Anneliese was a vessel for a number of demons, each one taking its turn to torment her. Her body became emaciated from the prolonged fasting and the physical toll of the exorcisms. She had stopped eating, drinking, and sleeping, convinced that it was the only way to rid herself of the demons. Her once beautiful face became gaunt and unrecognizable, her features distorted by the torment she had suffered. Despite the intervention of the priests, nothing seemed to quell the voices or the violent convulsions. It was as though Anneliese was caught in a never-ending cycle of suffering, her soul trapped in a war between good and evil. As the final exorcism session came to a close, Anneliese's voice took on a chilling tone, one that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. In a whisper barely audible, she uttered the words that would forever haunt those who were present. Beg for absolution. The final exorcism would be the last time anyone saw Anneliese alive. Her condition had worsened to such an extent that her body could no longer withstand the torment she had endured. The priests who had performed the exorcisms, Father Renz and Father Alt, were exhausted, spiritually, emotionally, and physically drained by the countless hours spent attempting to rid Anneliese of the demons that had taken control of her. On July 1st, 1976, Anneliese Michel died in her parents' home. Her death was a tragic consequence of the exorcism process, a result of extreme malnutrition, dehydration, and the toll the rituals had taken on her body. She was emaciated, her body a shell of what it once was, a testament to the horrors she had endured. Her death was ruled as a result of natural causes brought on by neglect. The medical examiner found that Anneliese's cause of death was malnutrition and dehydration. However, the circumstances surrounding her death led to an outcry, and her parents, along with the priests, were charged with negligent homicide. The trial that followed was highly publicized, and the case became the center of debate over whether Anneliese's possession had been real, or if her symptoms had been the result of mental illness. Many people began to question the role of the church and whether it had acted appropriately. Some believed that Anneliese was a victim of religious fanaticism, while others insisted that her case was proof of the existence of demons and the power of evil. The church stood by its decision to perform the exorcisms, but the public opinion was divided. The tragic story of Anneliese Michel would become one of the most controversial and debated cases in the history of exorcism. Anneliese's case remains one of the most chilling and debated stories of possession and exorcism in modern history. Her story is a tragic reminder of the dangers of fanaticism and the consequences of blind faith. It raises questions about mental illness, the power of belief, and the terrifying possibility that there may be forces beyond our understanding at work. The priest and her parents were convicted of negligent homicide and sentenced to prison. But the true horror of Anneliese's story lingers long after the legal proceedings ended. Her story continues to haunt the minds of those who hear it, a chilling reminder of the terrifying power that darkness can hold over the human soul. To this day, Anneliese's case remains a symbol of the fine line between faith and madness, possession and mental illness. Her name is remembered, but the question of what truly happened to her, the question of whether she was possessed by a demon or suffering from a severe mental breakdown, remains unanswered. And perhaps that is the true horror of her story, the uncertainty of what happened and the fear that it could happen again. Story 3. The Ghost of St. Andrew's Episcopal Church. St. Andrew's Episcopal Church stands in solemn grandeur atop a hill in the heart of Staten Island, New York. Established in 1708, it is one of the oldest churches in the United States. Its stone facade, weathered by centuries of storms, bears the marks of a rich and turbulent history, with crumbling ivy creeping up the walls like the fingers of time itself. The church's tall, narrow windows cast eerie, fragmented beams of light through the dimness of the sanctuary, and the winding paths that lead visitors to its front door seem to vanish into the dense wood surrounding the property. The ancient oak trees surrounding the church groan in the wind, their twisted branches resembling arms reaching to the heavens. Although it serves as a place of worship, many in the community whisper that St. Andrew's is more than just a house of prayer. It's a place where the veil between the living and the dead is thin. The church's history is steeped in tales of mysterious occurrences and unexplained events. Over the years, clergy and worshipers alike have reported unsettling experiences, and some say the spirits of the departed never truly left the grounds. For generations, the parishioners have claimed that the ghosts of former clergy members and parishioners haunt the church, drawn back by their unfinished business or restless spirits. On a cold, gray evening, the bells of St. Andrew's toll with a mournful ring, reverberating throughout the streets of Staten Island. Few walk the church's grounds after dark. For those who have dared to stay too long tell tales of the unsettling chill in the air, the feeling of being watched, and the unnerving whispers that seem to come from nowhere. But these eerie occurrences are just the surface. Beneath the surface, deeper and darker secrets have been buried for centuries, waiting for someone to uncover them. The first signs of something unusual at St. Andrew's appeared in the late 1800s. A parishioner attending Sunday service claimed to have seen the apparition of a former minister sitting in the back pew, his hands folded in prayer, as if awaiting the sermon. When others turned to see, the figure vanished, leaving only an overwhelming sense of sadness in its wake. Over time, more witnesses would report similar occurrences. Some described seeing a ghostly figure pacing near the altar, while others recounted hearing faint voices of long-departed clergy members offering prayers in a tongue long forgotten. One of the most chilling stories came from Father Jacob, the church's priest during the early 20th century. During a particularly stormy night, he was in the church alone, preparing for Sunday service the next morning. As he ascended the pulpit to check the Bible, he suddenly heard footsteps echoing through the sanctuary. The sound of slow, deliberate steps grew louder with each passing second. Father Jacob, heart pounding, turned to see who was there, but found no one. The steps continued, moving toward the altar, and then they stopped. But as he stood frozen in fear, a cold gust of wind blew through the open windows, extinguishing the candles on the altar, leaving the church in complete darkness. On another occasion, an organist, who had come to practice late in the evening, was disturbed by an eerie sound, an organ playing itself. The music echoed through the church, rising in intensity before abruptly halting. When the organist entered the sanctuary, the instrument sat eerily still, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from the shadows. In the years that followed, parishioners and clergy alike began to report other inexplicable events. During services, many claimed to feel sudden drops in temperature, as if the warmth of the congregation was being drained from the room. Others would hear faint whispers, low, unintelligible murmurs, that seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. Occasionally, visitors would notice the flickering of candles in the middle of the night, but when they returned in the morning, they would find the candles had been burned down to mere stubs. No explanation could be found. In 1973, a new chapter began in the history of St. Andrew's. The church was undergoing extensive renovations, and workers began to dig up the old floorboards in the rear of the sanctuary. What they uncovered left them speechless. Beneath the altar, hidden deep within the foundations of the church, was a small chamber, sealed off from the rest of the building. Inside, they discovered a collection of 18th century artifacts, including ancient religious relics, mysterious symbols scrawled on the walls, and old, tattered books that no one dared to touch. Among the items was a strange, unmarked coffin, but when the workers opened it, they were horrified to find no body inside, just a pile of bones and an old, rotting journal filled with cryptic messages. The discovery of the chamber set off a chain of events that would bring the church to the center of a dark and dangerous mystery. In 1990, a paranormal investigator named Robert Haynes, renowned for his work with haunted sites, was contacted by the church's board of trustees. They were concerned about the ongoing reports of supernatural activity, and they had a growing sense that something far more sinister lurked within the church's walls. Haynes was invited to conduct a full investigation. He arrived late one evening, after the last of the parishioners had left. Armed with his equipment, he began documenting the activity, setting up cameras in various parts of the church. As the night wore on, a sense of unease grew within him. The air in the church was thick with tension, as if the walls themselves were watching him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him to uncover its secrets. Haynes spent hours wandering the halls, listening for any sounds that might explain the strange reports. As midnight approached, he made his way to the altar, the focal point of many of the church's reported hauntings. He stood there in silence, hoping to capture something on his cameras, when he heard it, a soft, deliberate thud. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and measured, echoing from the back of the church. His heart raced as he turned toward the sound, but there was no one there. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped, and Haynes felt a heavy presence in the air pressing down on him. The lights flickered, and the sound of a whisper filled his ears. He couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a voice speaking from the darkness. Haynes pulled out his recorder, desperate to capture anything that would explain the chilling atmosphere. It was then that he saw it, a shadowy figure, moving across the altar. It was as if a human shape was materializing from the very air, its outline indistinct, but its presence undeniable. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, as though it were searching for something. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. Haynes, shaken but resolute, moved toward the altar to investigate further. As he did, he heard the unmistakable sound of whispers, louder now, as if coming from the walls themselves. The air felt colder, and Haynes could see his breath fogging in the air. He could no longer deny it. Something was not right in this church. The shadow he had seen, the whispers, the coldness. It all pointed to one conclusion. The church was haunted by something far darker than anyone had imagined. As Haynes attempted to make his way out, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. Trapped inside, he could feel the oppressive presence closing in. The footsteps began again, growing louder, closer. He tried to open the doors, but they were locked tight. In the distance, the faintest sound of organ music could be heard, rising in volume as though someone or something was playing it. Suddenly, Haynes felt a cold hand brush against his shoulder. Spinning around, he found himself face to face with an apparition, a figure dressed in ancient priestly robes, its face shrouded in shadows. The figure reached out, its hand extending toward him, and Haynes stumbled back in fear, unable to look away. As the ghostly figure moved closer, it spoke in a voice that seemed to come from every corner of the room at once, a voice that sent chills through his spine. Leave this place, or be forever bound to it. Haynes, terrified beyond measure, broke free and rushed toward the door. He slammed his shoulder against it, pushing with every ounce of strength until it finally opened. Gasping for air, he fled into the night, the sound of the organ music echoing in his ears long after he had escaped. In the weeks following Haynes' investigation, St. Andrew's Church became a focal point for paranormal enthusiasts and ghost hunters. Word spread about the haunting, and soon, tours were being offered to anyone brave enough to visit the church after dark. Despite the church's eerie reputation, visitors continued to report strange occurrences. Whispers in the shadows, flickering lights, and the occasional glimpse of shadowy figures moving in the pews. Some say the spirits of long-departed clergy members remain trapped within the church, forever bound to their sacred duty, while others claim the restless spirits of past parishioners continue to roam, seeking redemption or revenge. And though the church has embraced its haunted reputation, one thing remains certain. The mystery of the spirits of St. Andrew's will never be fully understood. The legacy of the church's haunted past continues to live on, its secrets buried deep within the cold stone walls. To this day, visitors speak of the cold spots that appear in the church, the whispers that fill the air during services, and the eerie sense of being watched. The ghosts of St. Andrew's Episcopal Church remain a chilling reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved. The spirits that haunt this place are not easily forgotten, and they continue to hold sway over those who dare to cross their threshold. Story 4. The Possession of Clara Germana Cele. In the early years of the 20th century, St. Michael's Mission, nestled in the heart of Natal, South Africa, was a humble institution. The small Catholic school had been established to educate the orphaned children of the region, offering them a future through education and faith. It was here, among the towering trees and the secluded expanse of fields, that a young girl named Clara Germana Cele lived and learned. Clara was just 16 years old, an orphan who had been taken in by the nuns at St. Michael's, and despite the loss of her family, she was a devoted and pious soul. She found comfort in prayer and the routine of religious life, taking solace in the rituals of the church. Her days were filled with study, quiet reflection, and the occasional moment of joy shared with her fellow students. But in the year 1906, everything changed. It began gradually, almost imperceptibly. At first, there were strange murmurs about Clara's behavior, whispers shared between the nuns and teachers. They noticed her growing distant, her eyes hollow and unfocused, as though something was stirring within her. At first, these changes were dismissed as the growing pains of adolescence, a phase she would soon grow out of. But as days passed, it became increasingly clear that something far darker was unfolding. Clara's transformation was both subtle and terrifying. She began speaking in strange, guttural tones, words that did not sound like anything the nuns had ever heard before. At first, it was just a few words spoken under her breath. But soon her speech became erratic, as though she was no longer in control of her own voice. And then came the convulsions, violent, uncontrolled movements that left Clara writhing in unnatural positions, as though her body was no longer her own. It wasn't long before the nuns and teachers began to realize that Clara was not the same girl who had arrived at St. Michael's Mission. On one particular morning, Clara's behavior escalated to horrifying extremes. As the sun streamed through the high windows of the schoolroom, Clara suddenly let out a loud, guttural scream, sending a chill down the spine of every person present. Her eyes, once gentle and kind, were now wide and unblinking, her pupils dilated to the point of being unnaturally black. She began to speak in languages no one could understand, her words flowing rapidly and erratically. Latin, ancient and forbidden, poured from her lips, as did German, a language Clara had never been taught. It was in this moment that the nuns knew that Clara was no longer the sweet, innocent girl who had entered their care. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and it was beyond their ability to control. The reports of Clara's strange behavior grew more unsettling as time went on. Her body began to twist and contort in unnatural ways, and the nuns found themselves unable to help her. The violence of her movements was beyond anything they had ever witnessed. Clara seemed to be levitating, her body floating off the ground as though lifted by an invisible force. Some of the other girls at St. Michael's were terrified to even look at her, and many fled the school in fear, unable to endure the horror of watching Clara's descent into what seemed to be madness. But it was not madness. Clara was not simply ill. What had taken hold of her was something far darker, a demonic presence that was using her body as its vessel. As the days passed, Clara's behavior became more erratic, and the nuns grew increasingly desperate. They could not look away from the terror that was unfolding before them, but they knew that they could not face it alone. With heavy hearts, they sent word to the church, requesting that priests be dispatched to perform an exorcism. The response was swift. 2 priests, Father Theophilus and Father Alphonsus, were chosen to confront the entity that had taken hold of Clara. These were men of great faith, experienced in the ways of exorcism, but even they could not have anticipated what they would encounter at St. Michael's Mission. As the priests arrived, they were greeted with the overwhelming stench of sulfur and decay, a sure sign that the forces they were about to confront were far from earthly. Clara, now bound to her bed, was surrounded by the nuns who watched in horror as the young girl began to speak in the voice of someone, or something, other than herself. The words that came from her mouth were venomous, her tone mocking and cold. "Your God is weak," Clara's voice hissed. "I will not leave this body. I will destroy her." The priests, undeterred by the taunting words, began their prayers. Father Theophilus recited the Latin incantations of the exorcism ritual, while Father Alphonsus held a crucifix over Clara's form. But Clara's eyes glowed with an unnatural fire, and her body jerked violently in response to the priest's efforts. It was as though the demon that had taken hold of her was fighting back with every ounce of its power. Clara's skin became slick with sweat, and her body twisted at impossible angles. At one moment, she was levitating above the bed, her limbs contorted and her mouth open in a silent scream. At another, she fell to the ground with a thud, only to rise again, her head now turned backward, her spine arched as though broken. Father Theophilus and Father Alphonsus could only watch in stunned silence as the battle raged between the priest and the demon that held Clara captive. During one particularly violent episode, Clara lunged at Father Theophilus with such force that he was thrown backward across the room. She was stronger than any human being should be. Her face twisted into a grotesque mask of rage as she growled in a deep, guttural voice, "You cannot defeat me. I am the master now." The priests pressed on, continuing their prayers with unwavering faith. But it was clear that this was not a simple exorcism. Clara was no longer just a girl who had been possessed. She was a vessel of a powerful and malevolent entity that sought to destroy everything in its path. It was not just Clara's body that was at war. It was her soul. The battle between good and evil raged for 2 full days. Father Theophilus and Father Alphonsus took turns praying over Clara, their voices rising in chants that echoed through the walls of St. Michael's Mission. Clara, meanwhile, thrashed and screamed, her body convulsing in violent spasms. Her voice had taken on a demonic tone, deepening unnaturally, as if coming from the very bowels of hell. Her body continued to defy the laws of nature, her limbs twisting in impossible angles, her head spinning around to face her tormentors. Every inch of her skin seemed to be scorched with a fiery heat, and yet she did not show any signs of fatigue. The demon, it seemed, was relentless. But as the priests continued their prayers, they noticed something that would give them hope. Clara's violent reactions began to slow. Her screams became weaker, her body less resistant to the power of the exorcism. It was as though the demon was finally beginning to lose its grip on Clara. Father Alphonsus raised the crucifix high, and with one final, powerful invocation, he shouted, "In the name of the Holy Father, I command you to leave this girl. Be gone, demon! Return to the depths from which you came." At that moment, Clara collapsed to the ground, her body limp and unresponsive. The room fell silent, save for the soft, labored breaths that escaped her lips. The priests knelt by her side, their hands raised in prayer. Clara's eyes flickered open, and for the first time in 2 days, she seemed to be free of the demonic force that had possessed her. Her voice, once guttural and harsh, was now soft and trembling as she whispered, "I am free." The demon had been expelled. Clara's soul had been reclaimed, and the horror that had gripped St. Michael's Mission was over. But the ordeal had left its mark, not just on Clara, but on everyone who had witnessed the terrible events. Clara Germana Cele returned to a normal life after the exorcism, but the experience remained etched in her memory. She was no longer the same innocent girl who had first arrived at St. Michael's Mission, though her faith remained unwavering. The memories of the possession haunted her for the rest of her life. The priests, too, were forever changed by the events they had witnessed. Father Theophilus and Father Alphonsus remained deeply shaken, but they continued their work as men of the cloth, their faith bolstered by the knowledge that they had saved Clara from a fate worse than death. The case of Clara Germana Cele remains one of the most disturbing and well-documented exorcism cases in history. For many, it is a chilling reminder of the battle between good and evil that can sometimes play out in the most unexpected and terrifying ways. Though Clara was freed from the demonic entity that had possessed her, the events of 1906 are still cited as one of the clearest examples of the supernatural's terrifying grip on the human soul. Clara's story serves as a stark reminder of the power of faith, the danger of the unseen world, and the eternal struggle between light and darkness. And for those who still seek answers to the mysteries of the supernatural, Clara Germana Cele's case remains one of the most disturbing, unsettling, and unforgettable exorcisms in the annals of history. Story 5. The Bell Witch of Tennessee. In the early 1800s, in the quiet rural town of Adams, Tennessee, the Bell family arrived to make a new life for themselves. John Bell, a hard-working farmer, had recently purchased a modest plot of land nestled among the dense forest that stretched as far as the eye could see. With his wife, Lucy, and their children, they sought peace and prosperity in the tranquility of the countryside. The farmhouse they moved into stood at the edge of the wilderness, a place where the nights were still and the stars shone bright in the sky. The Bells believed this remote location would offer them the life they had long dreamed of, far from the chaos of the town. But the Bells quickly realized that something was wrong, far beyond their understanding. It started slowly, just odd sounds in the dead of night. It began with faint knocks at their door, knocks that seemed to echo from deep within the walls. At first, John thought it was a trick of the wind or perhaps an animal, but it wasn't long before these noises became more frequent and more disturbing. In the weeks that followed, the disturbances escalated. The knocking sounds grew louder, and now they seemed to come from all corners of the house, as though unseen hands were tapping on the walls. The family could hear the sounds of footsteps pacing the floors at night when no one was awake, and sometimes the creaking of the floorboards echoed through the house, despite no one walking above or below. One evening, after a particularly harsh knock, the family heard a deep voice coming from nowhere, speaking words none of them could comprehend. The voice wasn't human. It was something else entirely. Soon after, strange occurrences began to happen in the Bell household that no earthly explanation could satisfy. Lucy Bell, while in her kitchen one night, swore she felt invisible hands tugging at the hem of her skirt, pulling it as though some unseen force was trying to drag her. At first, she dismissed it as nerves, but then the entity grew bolder. Objects began to move without cause. The doors of the house would open and close on their own, and the heavy furniture would shift as if something or someone was rearranging the very room. The source of all these disturbances, it seemed, was a malevolent spirit. Word spread quickly through the nearby settlements that the Bell family was living on cursed land, haunted by a vengeful spirit known only as Kate. The name struck fear in the hearts of all who heard it, and soon many whispered that Kate was a witch, a powerful, vengeful spirit who had cursed the land long ago. The Bells, however, did not know this name, nor did they understand the origin of the evil presence that now haunted their home. But the terrifying events were just beginning. As the days passed, the Bell family found themselves tormented by an invisible force that seemed to have a personal vendetta against them. The strange knocks continued, but now they were joined by something far worse, a disembodied voice. It began as a faint whisper in the night, barely audible, but it quickly became louder and more clear. The voice taunted them, calling them by name, offering threats and sinister promises. "John Bell, I know your sins," the voice would whisper in the dead of night. "You cannot hide from me." At first, the Bells thought the voice came from outside, or perhaps from a neighbor playing a cruel prank. But there were no other houses for miles around. The voice seemed to come from all around them, from the walls, from the shadows, from the very air itself. It wasn't just a voice. It was a force that seemed to know their every thought, every fear, and every secret. The attacks became more aggressive as time went on. The Bell family would be asleep, only to be suddenly awakened by their bedclothes being ripped off their bodies, yanked violently as if unseen hands were tugging at the blankets. No one could explain it, and no one could stop it. The sounds of laughter would fill the house, a cold, mocking cackle that chilled the blood. It was a laugh that held no joy, only malice. As the weeks passed, it seemed that no matter where they went or what they did, the Bell family could not escape the torment. But the most terrifying incidents were yet to come. The entity, Kate, seemed to have a particular target in mind: John Bell. The patriarch of the family, John had always been a man of strength and resolve, but the relentless attacks began to wear him down. He would often complain of a strange weakness, feeling as though something was draining the life from him. He would wake up in the middle of the night gasping for breath, his body cold and clammy as though he had been touched by death itself. John's condition grew worse with each passing day. His health deteriorated rapidly. He would become dizzy and confused, often unable to move or speak. The voice of Kate would taunt him endlessly, whispering in his ear, calling him out, cackling at his misery. "John Bell, I will make you suffer," it would hiss. The family tried everything to rid themselves of the evil presence. They called in local spiritualists and healers, but no one could explain the unearthly power that seemed to hold the Bell family in its grip. The more they tried to resist, the stronger Kate became. It seemed as though the entity had an endless well of power, feeding on the fear and terror that it instilled in the Bell family. And then one night, everything changed. It was late in the evening when John Bell suddenly fell gravely ill. He had been growing weaker for weeks, but now his condition took a sharp turn for the worse. The Bell family gathered around his bedside, but no one could help him. His breathing grew labored, his skin pale and clammy, and his eyes grew wide with fear. As they looked at him in horror, something caught their attention. An unusual liquid had pooled at the base of his pillow, a dark, viscous substance that seemed to have no earthly origin. No one could explain what it was, but it reeked of decay, of death. Kate's voice echoed through the room. "Louder than ever before, I have claimed him," it said. "John Bell will never escape me." In the darkness of the night, John Bell's body convulsed one last time, and then he fell still. He was dead. The Bell family was left in shock and disbelief. The patriarch was gone, his life stolen by the invisible force that had haunted them for so long. But the voice of Kate was not finished. "I will haunt you all," it taunted. "I will make sure you never forget my name." The death of John Bell marked the climax of the terror that had gripped the family for months. The family was now in a state of panic. The house that had once been their home was now a prison, and they were trapped in its nightmare. The Bell family, terrified and broken, knew they had no choice but to leave. The Bell family packed their belongings and fled the farmhouse, never to return. The house stood abandoned for many years, but the curse of the Bell Witch did not fade. Locals continued to report strange happenings in the area. Strange lights in the sky, disembodied voices whispering in the wind, and the sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. Paranormal investigators from all over the country visited the site, but they found nothing that could explain the eerie occurrences. Some said they felt a malevolent presence. Others reported hearing the same cackling voice that had tormented the Bell family. The house itself seemed to hold a dark energy, and many who dared to approach it would leave with a sense of dread they could not shake. The legend of the Bell Witch remains one of the most famous and terrifying, haunting stories in American folklore. The spirit of Kate is said to still haunt the land, her vengeful whispers echoing through the trees and the empty spaces where the Bell farmhouse once stood. To this day, visitors to the area report strange occurrences and unsettling feelings, as though the Bell Witch's curse has never truly been lifted. The Bell family's story remains a chilling reminder of the power of the supernatural and the terror that can haunt a place for generations. The name Kate is still whispered in hushed tones, and the Bell Witch continues to be one of America's most infamous legends, a ghostly figure whose power lingers long after the events of 1806. The Bell Witch legend remains one of the most terrifying and enduring hauntings in American folklore, a chilling reminder of the unknown forces that can haunt us from the shadows. The eerie whispers of Kate continue to echo through history, leaving behind a legacy of fear and fascination. If you found this story as chilling as we did, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more spine-tingling tales of the supernatural. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an unsettling story. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. What do you think really happened to the Bell family? Let's continue exploring the mysterious and the terrifying together